Hello, I have the honor of having this interview with Dr. Leon Fink, to whom we call León in Latin America, not only because his name is pronounced that way in Spanish, but because Leon has been like a león, working the history of the United States and also trying to construct links between the US history and the Latin American history. Dr. Fink is a distinguished professor of history at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and he's a specialist in American labor and immigration history and the Gilded Age progressive era. He has served as interim director of the PhD concentration in the history of work, race, and gender in the urban world, and edits the journal Labor Studies in Working Class History of the Americas. Dr. Fink is the author or editor of a dozen books, and he's a very important historian in the United States. He has been Fulbright Senior Scholar and past NEH Fellow. Professor Fink has also taken a leading role in national history education circles in the United States, where he has stressed the necessary collaboration between the university and the public schools. For the Plataforma, Memoria, Justicia, and América Latina, Professor Fink presented a paper entitled Friends in High Places, the U.S. Contribution to Costa Rica State Building in the Figueres Years. Professor Fink, thanks a lot for participating in our Plataforma.
Thank you, David. I've really enjoyed the connection to you and other scholars who came together for this meeting.
Leon, thinking about your paper, what can the Jose Figueres relationship do? Some U.S. agents can tell us about the complexity of U.S. foreign relations to Latin America.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was intrigued to look at the case of the U.S. and Latin America through a Costa Rican lens, which I had known very little about until recent years. It was actually our joint collaboration in the Labor Justice Across the Americas project that eventuated in a book that you participated in with a dozen or so others from across the hemisphere that really introduced me to Costa Rican history for the first time. And so I started to follow it up a little. And one reason that it attracted me is that the main, at least in the outline, the main outline seemed a little different than the dominant impression that I'd had, and that is the common assumption about U.S. relations to Latin America, in this sense that, we're used to the story about basically the story of U.S. imperialism in the hemisphere, and whether it's gunboat diplomacy or whether it's just the rigid, hardline anti-communism that has led to so many tragedies, really, in the region. That the story of Costa Rica seemed to step a little outside that framework and suggest that there were more spaces, and perhaps historically at least, more possibilities for development than I had assumed. Unfortunately, it's not like an either or story. You can't go from rags to riches when you study history. You have to stick to what actually happened, so that the story isn't, I didn't find a true alternative history. I don't think that's possible, but I did find pathways that proved more interesting and complex than I was had recognized before, and Costa Rica fit into one of those kind of exceptional cases, in my view, in the sense that by the end of World War II, I think the U.S., the leadership of the U.S., dominated by the New Deal Democratic Party led by Franklin Roosevelt, was imagining a more progressive, what we would today call a more progressive democratic politics that would connect American society and its progressive development or New Deal type development to a similar trajectory in Latin America. And the battle against the fascists, the battle against the Nazis had brought together a kind of alliance across the hemisphere that substituted Roosevelt's so-called good neighbor policy, encouraging and even insisting on a greater democracy in contrast to the earlier use of reliance on private corporations for U.S. dominance in the region. And I found that in the long run, this pattern of the good neighbor did not last long. It was cut short by the Cold War, really, and the hyper fears in the U.S., ultimately quite exaggerated fears of communist influence and penetration in the region that so alarmed the U.S. regime government, especially by the time of the Eisenhower Dulles foreign policy of the 1950s, and really continuing then through Kennedy and the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Dominican Republic et cetera, that the U.S. did step in with a heavy hand in general across certainly Central America and the Caribbean, and the U.S. showed increasingly little tolerance for other regimes, whether there was even corporate, not even necessarily communist regimes, but even so-called corporatist regimes, as in Argentina or Brazil. But in that general, I would say, sorry history, there were sprigs of complexity and possibility, and I think Costa Rica was one of them, because Costa Rica, in my view, as I studied it, it seemed like key developments shaping the modern Costa Rican state occurred at a propitious time, a fortunate time for Costa Rica, certainly, and for U.S. Progressive thinking, in the sense that the Costa Rican state was emerging in the period of the Second World War itself, when the U.S. was supporting so-called Popular Front regimes and welfarist regimes, so that the regime of initially of Calderon Guardia, and then even after of Pepe Figueres, were both cut from this cloth of what we might label social democracy or strong welfarist regimes. And the fact that they, and even the Figueres regime after the Civil War in Costa Rica was supported by key U.S. Leadership figures, particularly so-called liberals, who recognized in Figueres as an anti-communist liberal, a regime that they would support and offer strong support to, even when it came under threat, as it did from some of its more reactionary neighbors in the mid-1950s. So it did strike me that when you look at the region, Costa Rica stands out as an alternative path, in general, a path not taken, unfortunately, a path that the U.S. power actually didn't help to cut off any real many imitators, but the forces did come together in Costa Rica, and that's one of the reasons I found it so intriguing.
It is so intriguing. Leon, I remember when you were going to present your paper in this Plataforma, that you mentioned that the difference, probably the main difference in between your paper and those that other presentators were doing in this Plataforma, was that your paper focused on forgotten history. Why do you think that this specific Jose Figueres relationship to the U.S. is a forgotten history?
Mm-hmm. What made me think about that was actually the theme of the conference itself, which was about memory. And so I was in thinking about that my story was less about memory than I think stories that haven't been told or have been forgotten. And I think here's how I would elaborate that. I think the Costa Rican, what I called Costa Rican exceptionalism, the story of its development, its political path, especially in the PLN years of the rise of the PLN and Figueres and his relation to other Central American regimes is forgotten on both sides, both in Costa Rica and in the U.S. And here's my thinking on that is that on the U.S. side, one reason that people have forgotten the Costa Rican story, or it never rose to prominence in American thinking about the region, was that is precisely because the pathway in Costa Rica was an alternative pathway that where there was no major U.S. military intervention, unlike the readiness, the preparation for massive military intervention to turn back, to rely on U.S. military force to turn back communism at any instance where it appears. Costa Rica did not fit the model of a friendly business government to the U.S. If you weren't going to have communism, went the dominant U.S. argument, then you had to turn to the business classes, and you had to turn ultimately to military protection against communism. Well, neither of those proved necessary in Costa Rica, and it did suggest that you could have a developing state that did not pose any threat to the U.S. certainly, or its neighbors, without that kind of dramatic intervention. And in fact, a more socialist or social democratic path, allowing for independent state development, could actually end up proving a healthier neighbor for the whole region than the dominant U.S. policy. And that's on the U.S. side of forgetfulness. And on the Costa Rican side, I think there are two ways that Costa Ricans forgot about what was crucial to this period and its takeoff as an exceptional nation. And one is that I think, despite the credit that I'm giving to the long, really to the story of Figueres and the PLN going through Oscar Arias and other notable figures, despite that in fact the roots and the basic formula for Costa Rica's exceptionalism were really not liberal in the U.S. sense, but they were really rooted in a more corporatist, corporatist populist framework that was inaugurated by Figueres's own antagonist, Calderon Guardia, coming out of the 40s. And whatever one might think of what happened to him, what became of him politically, and his move to the right and his closeness to Somoza, all true. But nevertheless, and when he emerged to as El Doctor in the early 40s, he set about the labor guarantees and the essence of the welfare state with its rights for ordinary people that Figueres built on. Figueres really, despite thinking of himself as a revolutionary, and in my view, did not really transform, did not create a social revolution in Costa Rica. That had already happened. And it had not only happened through Calderon Guardia, but it had to do with this corporatist alliance between the state, the church, and the Communist Party, actually, in Costa Rica, who the strong labor movement in the 1940s really helped to lay the groundwork for the greater social distribution that came to characterize Costa Rica, at least as compared to its neighbors. So I think that's one that even those who came out the victors generally in Costa Rican history are not anxious to credit, their, who they're indebted to. And the second point is that, and this is even maybe more embarrassing to the Figueres types, is that while it's true that there was no military intervention, as in Guatemala, to take the most extreme example, nevertheless, the U.S. did put pressure, was crucial to the course of Costa Rican exceptionalism, in the sense that by 1955, after the U.S. helped to engineer the takedown of Arbenz in a communist-leaning regime in Guatemala, the same forces who destabilized Arbenz were gearing up to do the same thing in Costa Rica. There are various reasons why those forces, military as well as corporate interests, as well as neighboring groups like, the new Armas regime in Guatemala, once they took down Arbenz, as well as the Samosistas in Nicaragua, were eager to dismantle the Figueres regime. But it was, in this case, the U.S. and U.S. liberals, in my argument, like Adolph Burley, like Milton Eisenhower, like Senator Paul Douglas, and a whole host of others that I could go into, but who basically put pressure on the U.S. government not to allow these outside forces to destabilize Costa Rica, and even to sell Figueres government, fighter planes at $1 a piece, so that this is a country without an army, but nevertheless had an air force thanks to this intervention. And that kind of intervention, combined with there was also some intervention in Costa Rica by U.S. labor and regional labor groups, a particular group called ORIT, which is basically a front for the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, and its foreign policy. But they were operating pretty openly behind the Figueres government in various ways. So Figueres is as strong an independent voice, determinedly nationalist as he was there was some Yankee kind of liberal collaboration going on. And in this case, it was fortunate, I think, that it was not the hardline anti-communists who were intervening in Costa Rica, but in this case, it was the sort of liberal anti-communists who nevertheless saw the need for democracy and a degree of social welfare, though just was not the case in other places. So those are grounds that I think helped to. Those are all chapters in Costa Rican history that are too easily forgotten.
Yeah, that is true. Thank you very much to Dr. Leon Fink for this conversation. And thanks a lot for having participated in our conference. And hopefully we will hear more about your research about Latin America in other CALAS conferences.
Sure. Well, ojalá que pasa como eso. Okay.